April 1945, the war was ending, but the silence that followed had its own kind of terror. On the outskirts of Magdeburg, a small group of German women stood among the ruins of what used to be a street. Now only broken walls, collapsed beams, and the faint smell of burnt bread. They held onto the few things that had survived the fire: a child's doll, a cracked teapot, a torn photograph pressed between shaking fingers. From the distance came the low growl of an engine. An American Jeep stopped at the corner. Its tires crunched over the debris, dust rising in slow spirals. The women froze, some clutching their shawls tighter, others turning away. For weeks, they had heard stories of revenge, of occupation, of punishment. But the soldier who stepped down did not shout or point his weapon. He carried a small bundle wrapped in khaki cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it, and there they were. Family photographs, faded portraits of husbands in Wehrmacht uniforms, children in Sunday clothes, grandmothers standing by blooming gardens long since turned to ash. The women stared, disbelieving. No one spoke. The soldier simply handed them back, one by one. A quiet act of decency at the end of a world gone mad. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing from within. The once proud Reich had become a shattered landscape of hunger, silence, and disbelief. Entire cities lay in ruins, Berlin smoldering, Cologne reduced to twisted iron, Dresden nothing but scorched stone. The thunder of Allied bombers had long faded, but the echo of their devastation remained in every corner. For ordinary Germans, survival had replaced ideology. Most of the men were gone, dead, captured, or still fighting on distant fronts that no longer existed. Those who remained were the very old, the very young, or the wounded. It was the women who bore the aftermath. They cleared rubble with bare hands, searched for food in the wreckage of stores, and tried to protect children who had never known peace. When the war had begun, the propaganda had promised glory. By its end, it offered only shame and fear. To the west, the Americans were advancing with deliberate precision. To the east, the Red Army tore through villages with vengeance. Every step forward brought Germany closer to surrender, and its people closer to a reckoning they did not yet understand. Rumors spread like smoke that the Soviets showed no mercy, that women were taken, homes looted, lives destroyed. In contrast, the Americans were an unknown, feared, but also whispered about with fragile hope. Some said they handed out chocolate to children. Others said they smiled. For the first time, German civilians faced the human reality of the enemy they had been taught to despise. When the first U.S. units crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they entered a land already defeated not just militarily, but spiritually. What they saw was not a triumphant nation of warriors, but starving families, hollow-eyed mothers, and children clutching empty pots. The American soldiers were young too, many barely out of high school. They had fought their way through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Siegfried Line. They had seen friends die, villages burn, and towns filled with civilians who had once cheered their destruction. Yet as they stepped into Germany itself, something changed. The propaganda that had fueled their hatred began to fade. What replaced it was confusion, and then compassion. They saw women walking barefoot through snow. They saw children staring at them with open, terrified eyes. They saw photos, hundreds of them, scattered across ruined houses, faces of families who had once believed themselves untouchable. For the Americans, those photographs were haunting. Each one was a reminder that behind every uniform, behind every city shelled into dust, there had been a life. Ordinary, fragile, undeserving of such ruin. Military orders were clear. Discipline above all. General Eisenhower had instructed all Allied forces to maintain strict control. There would be no looting, no unnecessary violence, no personal retribution. America's moral power, he insisted, must be shown not through conquest, but through conduct. The war would be won not only on the battlefield, but in how they treated the defeated. And so, as towns fell, soldiers were instructed to secure civilians, disarm remaining troops, and prevent chaos. They entered homes not as raiders, but as guardians of order. In many cases, German families were too frightened to even look up. They expected humiliation. What they received, instead, was restraint. The small gestures were what people remembered. A soldier leaving food at a doorstep, another helping an elderly man cross a road littered with debris. But among these gestures, one moment stood out, quiet, almost invisible, yet unforgettable. It began when soldiers started finding family photographs while clearing captured homes or abandoned bunkers. Some of these pictures were hidden in drawers. Others lay in the mud beside destroyed walls. They showed everything the war had broken. Weddings, babies, picnics, soldiers smiling before battle. The Americans could have burned them, mocked them, or kept them as souvenirs. Instead, they did something no one expected. They returned them. Sometimes directly, when the owners could be found. Sometimes through local churches or town halls. A gesture so simple it defied the logic of war. And yet, in those quiet exchanges, a photograph given back, a look of disbelief from a German woman, the moral weight of the entire conflict shifted for just a moment. This was not mercy in the abstract. It was decency made visible, the kind that survives even when nations collapse. And it began to spread, unspoken, from soldier to soldier, town to town. The war was not yet over, but the seeds of reconciliation had already been planted in the ruins of a defeated land. When American forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, the war had already taken an unbearable toll on both sides. For the Allies, victory was in sight, but exhaustion ran deep. Thousands of U.S. soldiers had been fighting almost non-stop since Normandy. They carried not only weapons, but also the emotional weight of years of horror. Yet from the beginning, Allied command made one point unshakably clear. Discipline and restraint would define the occupation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHE-EF, issued strict codes of conduct for troops entering Germany. Soldiers were forbidden to engage in revenge acts, looting, or unnecessary violence against civilians. Eisenhower understood the dangerous balance of power. Germany was defeated, but not yet peaceful. The eyes of the world were watching. The moral authority of the United States depended not just on its victories in battle, but on its behavior in victory. Field commanders reinforced these orders daily. Leaflets circulated among troops, reminding them that their mission was to bring peace, not vengeance. One directive read, "You are not here to humiliate the German people, but to end the war they began." In a Europe buried beneath rubble, this instruction meant everything. It reminded young soldiers, many of them only 19 or 20, that their rifles carried not just bullets, but the responsibility of representing their nation's conscience. To enforce this moral code, military police units patrolled occupied zones, ensuring that civilians were treated with respect and property remained untouched. U.S. Army chaplains and officers briefed troops on humanitarian standards before entering German towns. They were told that every interaction mattered, that a single act of cruelty could destroy months of progress, but a single act of kindness could begin to rebuild trust. The Germans, meanwhile, were living in the shadow of their own propaganda. For years, Nazi broadcasts had painted the Allies as monsters, barbaric invaders who would slaughter civilians and destroy everything sacred. When the first American convoys appeared, many women and children hid in basements, trembling at every knock on the door. The fear was not imagined. They had seen what the war could do. But what awaited them was something few had anticipated: soldiers who offered food, not punishment. In destroyed towns, American troops began setting up field kitchens for civilians. They handed out soup, bread, and sometimes even chocolate. Simple acts that carried immense weight. These gestures did not erase the war's crimes or the hatred that had fueled it, but they began to carve out a fragile space for humanity amid the wreckage. Among the ruins, soldiers often discovered personal belongings left behind during evacuations. Diaries, letters, jewelry, and photographs. Each item carried traces of a life interrupted. To the men who found them, these were not spoils of war. They were relics of the human cost. Some soldiers, moved by what they saw, began returning these objects whenever possible. Reports circulated quietly through battalions of men who, instead of pocketing keepsakes, sought out the families they belonged to. A photograph of a wedding couple found in a burnt. For German civilians, the final months of the war were lived in a fog of fear. Every sound of boots in the distance brought panic. The Wehrmacht had collapsed. The Reich's promises had vanished. And now, only survival mattered. The women who remained in the towns and villages of central Germany had endured years of bombings, starvation, and propaganda that told them Allied soldiers were beasts. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, hiding them at the sight of foreign uniforms. But when the first Americans arrived, reality contradicted every nightmare they had been taught to expect. They did not come kicking down doors or shouting orders. They came quietly, their uniforms covered in dust, their faces tired, their eyes cautious but not cruel. The women noticed small details, a soldier lowering his rifle when he saw a child, another stopping to feed a stray dog. And then, the photographs. Those who received them would remember the moment for the rest of their lives. A stranger, in an olive green jacket, holding out something deeply personal. Something they never thought they'd see again. Some of those women cried not from joy, but from confusion. The enemy had shown them mercy. For years they had been told that the Americans were demons, that they would destroy everything German. Now, standing face to face with them, the truth was disarming. These men did not look like monsters. They looked human, young, and just as weary of war. There are scattered testimonies in post-war records, diaries, and letters that echo the same feeling. Disbelief. One German nurse wrote that an American soldier returned her brother's portrait after finding it in a destroyed medical station. He smiled and said, "He looks like a good man," she recalled. "I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the picture." That moment became her symbol of survival. A fragment of her. Family's dignity preserved by the very people she had been taught to fear. For the Americans, these encounters were equally complex. They had seen what Nazi Germany had done to Europe. The camps, the cities reduced to ash, the cruelty inflicted in its name. Many entered Germany expecting to see only guilt and hatred. Yet the faces they met were those of frightened civilians, mothers, widows, and children who had lost everything. The act of returning a photograph was not planned. It was instinctive. It was a way to remind themselves that even in war, they had not become what they fought against. The moral angle morality in wartime is rarely black and white. Soldiers live by orders, but conscience exists in the spaces between them. For the U.S. Army, the final phase of World War II tested not only military might, but moral endurance. After years of seeing comrades die, villages destroyed, and atrocities uncovered, the temptation for revenge was real. Yet, most American troops resisted it. They had been raised in a democratic culture that emphasized responsibility, that one must remain decent even when surrounded by indecency. The military code of conduct reinforced this ideal. Field commanders, reminded their men that how they behaved in victory would shape how history remembered them. Eisenhower himself understood that America's future in post-war Europe would depend on moral authority as much as on tanks or bombers. The war had already proven who was stronger. Now it would reveal who was better. To the civilians, that difference was life-changing. Every act of fairness from an American soldier, a meal shared, a door repaired, a photograph returned, became a quiet refutation of Nazi lies. For many German women, it was the first time in years they had seen decency from a man in uniform. The Reich had taken their husbands, brothers, and sons and turned them into ghosts. Now, strangers in foreign uniforms were treating them with more respect than their own leaders ever had. By April 1945, the U.S. Army's occupation of Western Germany had become a vast logistical operation. Not a campaign of conquest, but of control. Cities lay in ruins, bridges were gone, and millions of displaced civilians moved through roads meant for tanks. Yet among the chaos, discipline was rigidly maintained. Commanders like General Omar Bradley and Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges understood that the American presence had to project both strength and order. Soldiers were trained not only to secure positions, but to stabilize what was left of civilian life. Military police units were deployed to maintain peace in captured towns, while intelligence officers cataloged personal belongings found in abandoned homes, schools, and command posts. In those dusty archives, trunks, suitcases, scattered letters, they often discovered personal effects that told intimate stories of families separated by war. Some items, like photographs, medals, or wedding rings, were returned when possible through local intermediaries. These acts were not officially part of military protocol, yet they reflected the same discipline that kept the U.S. Army from descending into chaos. Where other advancing armies in history had used occupation to punish or humiliate, the Americans sought stability. Every small gesture, from distributing food to returning personal items, served a strategic purpose: to establish legitimacy and trust among the defeated population. A town where civilians did not resist was a town that did not need garrisons. A woman who believed in the fairness of her occupier was less likely to hide a sniper in her home. The humane treatment of civilians, though morally right, was also tactically sound. The Army understood that rebuilding trust was cheaper than rebuilding walls. This discipline made the American advance unique. Even as German propaganda crumbled, civilians began to whisper among themselves, "They don't behave like we were told." That simple realization, spreading from one household to another, helped dismantle years of indoctrination faster than any leaflet or broadcast could. In a war defined by industrialized destruction, control was no longer just about firepower. It was about restraint. And for many American units, returning something as small as a family photograph became a symbol of that control, proof that victory had not devoured their humanity. The cultural angle, culture, had been one of Nazi Germany's greatest tools and one of its deepest betrayals. For 12 years, the regime reshaped identity, turning citizens into instruments of ideology. The family photograph, once a private expression of love or memory, became politicized. Posters encouraged German mothers to raise sons for the Führer. Family portraits in uniforms became tokens of loyalty to the Reich. When American soldiers found these images, often burned, torn, or trampled, they saw something else entirely. To them, these were the faces of ordinary people trapped in a system they could not control. Many soldiers carried photographs of their own families, folded inside helmets or hidden in breast pockets. The connection was immediate, wordless. That recognition, "This could be my mother, my sister, my wife," turned enemy artifacts into human artifacts. In that moment, culture reclaimed its original purpose: to connect, not divide. The act of returning a photograph was, in a quiet way, a cultural reconciliation. It bridged the distance between two worlds, one raised under freedom, the other under fear. For the German women who received their photos back, the shock went beyond gratitude. It shattered a cultural wall built by years of propaganda. The Reich had told them that weakness was shameful, that compassion was treason. Yet here stood an American soldier, a supposed enemy, embodying both. In their eyes, the contrast between Nazi brutality and Allied restraint was more than moral. It was civilizational. Historians later noted that these moments formed the psychological foundation for Germany's post-war recovery. When Reconstruction began under Allied occupation, cooperation came not just from orders, but from a slow rebuilding of trust. Small acts of respect had made that possible. The emotional angle. There is a photograph preserved today in the Bundesarchiv, a black and white image of a German woman clutching several family pictures in her hands, tears streaking her face, as an American soldier walks away in the background. The caption simply reads, Magdeburg, 1945. It is a moment frozen between defeat and dignity. For those who lived it, such moments were indescribable. The return of a photo meant more than the recovery of an object. It was the recovery of identity. It told the woman, you still belong to something, to someone. In a world where every symbol of order had collapsed, that reminder carried power. Many German civilians later said that these acts were the first steps toward believing life could continue. They no longer saw the Americans as destroyers, but as witnesses. Witnesses who had seen the ruins and chosen not to add to them. That emotional shift marked the true beginning of post-war reconciliation. For the American soldier, too, the exchange left a mark. Some later spoke of how it reminded them of home, of what they were fighting to preserve. One veteran years later said, I didn't know her name. I just handed her the photo and walked away. But for a moment, I remembered why I still wanted to be human. Those words, though personal, speak to a universal truth of war, that the smallest human gesture can outlast the greatest destruction. And in 1945, amid the ruins of a defeated empire, that truth quietly passed from one set of trembling hands to another. For many American soldiers, returning those photographs was not merely an act of kindness. It was psychological survival. Combat had pushed them into moral gray zones, where the difference between right and wrong blurred into instinct and exhaustion. Each destroyed town, each civilian corpse, hardened something inside them. Yet, for those who chose restraint, humanity became their last defense against the mental collapse that followed prolonged violence. Army psychologists later noted that soldiers who engaged in humane behavior toward civilians, feeding them, offering cigarettes, helping the wounded, displayed fewer post-war trauma symptoms. It was as if these small gestures restored their sense of control over chaos, reminding them that they were not destroyers by nature. For them, returning a photograph was more than mercy. It was a declaration. I still know what it means to be human. And in those moments, the Germans saw it too. The fear etched deep in their faces softened, if only slightly. It was the beginning of an unspoken reconciliation, not of politics, but of shared humanity on a broken continent. Angle 5. Women and the Memory of Loss. The women who received those photographs carried the memory of that moment for decades. Many wrote about it later, in quiet memoirs or letters never published. Their recollections were strikingly similar. The disbelief, the trembling hands, the tears that refused to fall. For them, those photographs were fragments of identity rescued from annihilation. Under the Nazi regime, women had been instructed to embody loyalty, purity, and sacrifice. When the regime collapsed, those same virtues turned into burdens. Loyalty to ghosts, purity amid rubble, sacrifice with no purpose. To have a photograph returned by an American soldier disrupted that psychological conditioning. It forced them to confront an impossible truth. The enemy had shown more humanity in defeat than their own leaders had shown in war. Some of those women would later join local reconstruction committees, help feed orphaned children, or open makeshift schools in church basements. It was as if the act of receiving compassion rekindled their own. Angle 6. The Forgotten Symbolism. There is an understated symbolism in the photograph itself. A photograph captures a moment, a frozen memory untouched by ideology. In war, photographs were often used as propaganda, smiling soldiers on posters, leaders on banners, images of strength. But in the rubble of 1945, photographs reverted to what they had always been: the faces of the loved and the lost. When an American soldier returned a German family's photo, he was unknowingly returning something far deeper than paper and ink. He was giving back a timeline, a memory of pre-war innocence, a sense of belonging, and a trace of what peace once looked like. In doing so, he connected both sides of the battlefield through a shared human longing to be remembered. Many of those photographs would later find their way into post-war archives, sent to relatives abroad or kept in private drawers. Today, historians studying occupation-era Germany still stumble upon these images. Faces whose names are lost, but whose stories whisper quietly from the edges of history. Angle 7. The Moral Paradox of Victory. For the U.S. soldiers, victory came with moral questions. They had fought against tyranny, yet they stood now in cities filled with widows and children, the innocent remnants of the defeated. Some soldiers struggled to reconcile the joy of triumph with the empathy they felt for those who had lost everything. General Eisenhower himself had urged restraint. In his field notes, he wrote that America's victory must be measured not by vengeance, but by the restoration of order. This mindset filtered down through ranks in subtle ways, through command briefings, unit discipline, and simple acts like returning photographs. It was a deliberate moral positioning, to win a war and still remain civilized. This restraint, however, was not universal. There were darker moments: theft, violence, revenge. But what makes the story of those returned photos so striking is precisely that it defied the darkness. It represented the rare instance when decency prevailed against the temptation of retribution. As the U.S. troops moved deeper into Germany, these moments of quiet compassion formed an invisible thread, one that helped reweave the social fabric of a shattered nation. April 25, 1945. Elbe River, Germany. On the bridge near the small town of Torgau, two armies met. One advancing from the west, one from the east. American and Soviet soldiers shook hands over the shattered remains of the Third Reich. The war in Europe was breathing its last, but the air was still thick with uncertainty, tension, and exhaustion. For many German civilians, the line between survival and destruction was drawn not by generals or treaties, but by the soldiers who occupied their streets. Across towns like Halle, Leipzig, and Magdeburg, the Americans were now face to face with the human aftermath of Nazi rule. Mothers clutching infants, old men with hollow eyes, families emerging from cellars where they had hidden for weeks. In one such village south of Magdeburg, a young American corporal named William Carney led a small patrol through rows of burnt houses. They were looking for hidden snipers, the so-called werewolf units, that still ambushed Allied patrols in acts of desperate resistance. The smell of smoke mixed with the sweetness of spring blossoms returning through the cracks of destruction. They found no soldiers, only women and children sitting quietly in what had once been a bakery. The women stared at the GIs, expecting the worst. Rumors had spread of Soviet brutality, of revenge, of retribution. But the Americans were not there to punish. They were there to end a war. Carney noticed something half buried under a layer of ash. A photo album, its leather cover warped by heat. He picked it up and turned the pages slowly. A wedding picture, a soldier in uniform, a baby smiling in sunlight. It was, like countless others, a family story cut in half by history. He could have left it there, but instead, he wrapped the album in a piece of his own blanket and placed it near the woman sitting by the door. She didn't move at first. Then, with trembling hands, she took it and began to weep silently. That small act was witnessed by his comrades. One of them, a medic named Arthur Lee, later wrote in his diary, "In a world where everything we touched turned to ruin, that was the first thing I saw restored." Scenes like this repeated quietly across central Germany. In Helmstedt, in Dessau, in the outskirts of Hanover, soldiers found photographs, letters, keepsakes. Some mailed them to local Red Cross stations. Others left them on doorsteps. It wasn't part of any order or policy. It was instinct, the human urge to return what war had taken. Meanwhile, the war itself was collapsing in on its center. Hitler was trapped in his bunker. His ministers were fleeing or turning on one another. And yet, in the final chaos, the moral weight of the conflict shifted from grand speeches and declarations to small acts of conscience. In the ruins of Nuremberg, American correspondents recorded that civilians began showing Allied officers hidden caches of family photos, medals, and letters they had buried for safekeeping. Many of these civilians, especially women, approached soldiers with fear, only to be met with unexpected gentleness. To understand the power of that moment, one must imagine the psychological dissonance. For years, propaganda had painted the Allies as monsters. Now, those same monsters were returning memories, not taking them. It was a turning point not only militarily, but morally. Germany had fallen, but civilization had not. American war correspondents noted this shift. In late April, Stars and Stripes published a small column titled "The Things We Gave Back," describing how U.S. soldiers were returning personal items, photos, letters, trinkets, to German civilians. It was not celebrated, not dramatized. It was quiet, but it mattered. Because amid the destruction of cathedrals, the smoking ruins of Berlin, and the endless columns of refugees, the act of giving something back, even a photograph, stood as a symbolic counterweight to the entire machinery of war. It was the moment when the victors, still armed and alert, realized that true victory was not in domination, but in restraint. And as the gunfire faded, and the Third Reich's flags were torn down one by one, a strange calm settled across the conquered nation. In that stillness, a question hung in the air. What kind of peace would follow this war? The answer would begin, unexpectedly, in the basements and kitchens of occupied homes, where soldiers and civilians, once enemies, sat across from each other, separated only by memory and mercy. In the end, wars are remembered for their battles, their generals, and their victories. But history's true redemption often hides in smaller, quieter acts, the ones too gentle to make headlines. When American soldiers returned family photographs to German civilians in 1945, it was not a grand diplomatic gesture. It was not strategy nor propaganda. It was something older, something simpler. A recognition that even in the aftermath of hate, the human heart still knows the difference between cruelty and compassion. That moment, The handing back of a photograph in a ruined home symbolized more than mercy. It marked the beginning of moral reconstruction. In those seconds, the lines between enemy and liberator blurred. The war's victors became caretakers of a broken people, and the defeated rediscovered a reason to trust. For Germany, that trust became the first fragile foundation of peace. For America, it became a moral inheritance, proof that power could be tempered by conscience.